Hello everybody and welcome to this Waterstones event. I'm Sarah Shaffi and I'm here today to talk to three brilliant authors, Kalynn, Bayron, Ciannon Smart and Namina Forna. If you are joining us and you're not watching the football, I can guarantee that you'll have a less tense and much more enjoyable time. Before I introduce all of our authors, just to say that there'll be a chance for audience questions for the last 20 minutes or so of this event. So please do pop anything you want in the Q&A box, which I'm sure after a year or so in the pandemic, you all know is at the bottom of your screens. And now to introduce our writers. Kalynn Bayron is the best-selling author of Cinderella is Dead. She's a classically trained vocalist, and when she's not writing, you can find her listening to Ella Fitzgerald on loop, attending the theatre, watching scary movies, and spending time with her kids. She currently lives in San Antonio, Texas, where it's storming today, and her second novel, which we'll be talking about today, is called The Poison Heart. So welcome. Our next author is Ciannon Smart. She grew up in a small town in the southeast of England. As the only daughter in a house full of boisterous sons, she developed a voracious appetite for reading from an early age, preferring anarchy in stories rather than in real life. And in YA, she loves her heroines exactly as she loves her villains, willful, wily, and unpredictable. And we'll definitely be talking about all of those things. And her novel is called Witches Steeped in Gold. Hi, Ciannon. And last but not least, Namina Forna is a young adult novelist based in Los Angeles and the author of the epic fantasy YA novel The Gilded Ones. Originally from Sierra Leone in West Africa, she moved to the US when she was 9 and has been travelling back and forth ever since. And Namina loves building fantastical worlds and telling stories with fierce female leads. Hi, all of you. It's so lovely to see you. Thank you very much for joining us. I know that there will be people watching who have read your books, and I know that some people will have started them but not finished them, and I know that others will have them on their to read piles. So let's get you to introduce your novels and sort of give a little taster of them. So Kalynn, I'm going to start with you. Tell us what The Poison Heart is about.
So this Poison Heart is the story of 16-year-old Briseis Green. She's a young woman born with a unique ability. She can control plants. Think if Poison Ivy was a 16-year-old Black girl from Brooklyn. She is kind of navigating being a teenager and having this gift when her recently deceased auntie leaves her a sprawling estate in upstate New York. And she goes up with her moms to check it out for the summer and uncovers a strange family lineage and a big Victorian mansion filled with secrets, a walled garden filled with the deadliest plants on the planet, and a secret so deadly that even the threat of its revelation might cause the gods themselves to intervene. So it is a contemporary YA fantasy, and it centers queer Black girls.
Wonderful, thank you. Ciannon, tell us about Witches Steeped in Gold. Who do we spend time with in your book? Oh, I think you're muted still.
I am muted, sorry.
Yes, now you're not.
I was saying, Kalynn, that your book sounds amazing and I love Poison Ivy. Okay, so Witches Steeped in Gold is a Jamaican-inspired YA fantasy that follows two witches from rival orders, Jasmine and Ira, who are forced to unite in order to take down a mutual enemy. Ira is juggling some expectations from family members and the journey that she herself wants to take. There's a little bit of clashing between the dead and the living, and the past and the present. And Jasmine has many issues. She is dealing with the idea of inheriting an island and ruling, and this idea of being ready and perhaps not being ready. And they are forced to, as I've said, unite in order to meet their goal, which essentially is revenge.
All that good stuff. Brilliant. And Namina, tell us about The Gilded Ones.
So The Gilded Ones is a young adult fantasy set in sort of in a very patriarchal sort of ancient type world called Otera, where there are a group of girls who are considered monsters because they're faster and stronger than regular people and they bleed gold. But then actual monsters come into this world and the humans are like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. I think we need those girls to fight those demons and hopefully they'll kill each other off. So they offer the girls a choice, fight or die. My main character, Deka, decides to fight, and in doing so goes on an adventure that changes her life. And also, by the way, y'all will notice me looking down, and that is because we're joined by my beloved child, Niffy. So.
That's brilliant. Namina, I'm going to stick with you for this next question to answer first. And I'm intrigued by the inspirations for all of your novels. So Namina, can you talk a little bit about Gilded Ones and sort of what the spark was? Did you come up with the character of Deka first? Was there the sort of the magic concept or the monsters? What was it that sort of led you into writing this story?
So The Gilded Ones was a book that came in steps and was sort of a long time in the making. Initially, I was I was an undergrad at Spelman College, which is all female and all Black. And I would have these sort of recurring dreams of this girl, and she's wearing golden armor and she's like walking slow motion onto a battlefield. And like you see her sort of jump up into the air, swords in hand, and the dream always cuts out. I never knew where it went. But I always knew that like this was someone that I was interested in doing a story about. I grew up in Sierra Leone, West Africa, and it was super patriarchal. You know, like there was always an expectation as a girl that you had to be a certain type of way. And you had to be a certain type of way in order to be an acceptable person. And when I came to America, it was interesting to me that it was sort of the same thing, like different shades, but like, you know, this whole idea of people always having a certain definition of what it means to be a girl or a woman. And oftentimes it seemed to me that it was to our detriment. So I always had questions about this, and like I'd always ask and people would be like, oh, you're just, you know, like, why do you always ruin things? And it was only at Spelman that I took women's studies classes and I realized, wait a second, this is a system, you know, like patriarchy is a system, and this is something that I can write about. So at Spelman, I was like, oh, I want to write a book that talks about patriarchy, you know, what it looks like and who suffers under it, and to sort of explain it in a simple way. And once I came up with that, I was like, wait a second, it's that girl in this. And then I had to like be like, okay, so what is the world? I know it has to be African and all these things, but like it was just like, oh, I had the girl before, but then once I was like, I want to write a book about this, all of a sudden everything sort of came together.
Amazing. Ciannon, what about you? Any dreams of your characters, or did you sort of how did your approach to the book work?
I mean, mine would probably have been nightmares, if anything, because the subject matter, Obia, it's a little bit taboo, it's a little bit dark. I visited Jamaica a few times. One of the trips, I was 11 and we went to Rose Hall, which is a former plantation manor, and I learned about Annie Palmer, this alleged white witch who used her slaves' Obia magic to kill off her 3 husbands. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever at 11, so think what you will. And I loved this idea that Jamaica had witches and it had this magic system that to me before had predominantly been a Western thing. I grew up with Sabrina the Teenage Witch. I absolutely loved that sitcom. And I was just hooked at the fact that in Jamaica they also had witchcraft, but it was darker and it was forbidden. And it was forbidden because the colonizers that thought that the slaves coming from the then Gold Coast were too rebellious, so they banned opium magic in this practice. And I mean, I loved that it was a symbol of resistance, and you have figures like Nanny of the Maroons, who led a resistance from the Blue Mountains in Jamaica, and she was also called a witch because she was using these strategies that were unfamiliar to the English and the Spanish. And I just loved it. I just thought that it stood for so much beyond being taboo and fearful, because I mean, it's still something that's feared today. Like, my aunt was on the phone with my mum the other week, and she was saying that one of her friends thought that someone had spoken to an Obia woman, and that's why she didn't get this job that she went for. So I loved that it was something that was firmly entrenched in the past, but is also active in Jamaica today. So it took 10 years. I didn't start writing Witches Steeped in Gold until I was 21. And I realised that I could write a fantasy book, because I grew up with fantasy, I absolutely loved it. That I realised I could write a book with a Black female protagonist. I hadn't seen any until I read The Bells by Doniel Clayton, and then Ember in the Ashes was a huge book written by a brown writer, and that kind of gave me the nudge to, you know, you can put a character that looks like you in these worlds that you love so much. And there was only going to be one thing that I was going to write about, and it was this dark eldritch magic system. It was going to have all the things I enjoy: unreliable narrators, characters who are just stabbing each other in the back, and this vast sprawling world that was inspired by so many fantasy worlds that I have read and loved. So that's kind of Witches Steeped in Gold's origin story. Many drafts later, we have a complete book.
Amazing, thank you. And Kalynn, what about you? So this Poison Heart is set in our contemporary world, but it has these kind of fantastical elements. Was it this Poison Ivy-esque idea that came to you first, or sort of did you picture this big old house or something?
Yeah, it was a little of both. I was tremendously inspired by Gothic literature for this story, particularly the work of Shirley Jackson and Robert Louis Stevenson. I'm a huge Gothic horror fan. I also think there's a case to be made for Toni Morrison's Beloved as a Gothic novel. And I just love Gothic literature because of the kind of foreboding atmosphere, this creeping sense of dread. I really wanted to put that against a contemporary backdrop. And so, that was part of it. There was also just, different kind of storytelling devices that I really, that I love, fairy tales. It's the same kind of things that inspired me for my previous book, Cinderella is Dead, came into play here too. I really wanted, a story about a young woman who, is just a normal kind of teenager trying to navigate all these normal things that most 15 or 16-year-olds are, but she has this gift. And how do you kind of navigate a world where you still have a curfew and you still have parents who are like knee deep in your business? And how do you be the chosen one when your mom is like, where are you and what are you doing and who are you going with and when are you going to be back? I wanted this very kind of contemporary feel with all of these other elements kind of thrown in. And I also was hugely inspired by the Alnwick Garden, which is there in the UK, and it has this poison garden, that's sectioned off. And I read about this in 2017 and wrote it down and was just kind of like, okay, that's, hugely interesting to me. So I had all of these different story elements and decided to try and just do a contemporary fantasy that was very, that just felt very much like home, with the family and this kind of big creepy mansion and this walled garden with all these secrets. It really is just a combination of all the things that I love in the stories that I read.
All of your books do sort of feel part of like a bigger mythology in a way, if that's the right sort of way to phrase it. And Kalynn, perhaps you can start with this. Briseis is named for a very famous Greek character, and your book also contains characters called Circe, Medea. Wondered if you could talk a little bit about why you sort of turned to Greek mythology and what sort of associations that enabled you to kind of have the reader make without having to do lots and lots of explanation.
Yeah, so I've been fascinated with Greek mythology since forever. Probably started with Disney movies, but I'm a huge fan of the Percy Jackson stories and Madeline Miller's work. And I kind of wanted to do something with Greek mythology, but I didn't want to do the Olympians. I didn't want to do these gods and goddesses that we're already familiar with. I really wanted to go back and kind of see if there was something else there, some other kind of story to be told. And while I was researching for this story, what I found were stories of Medea, which I was familiar with because I studied opera in college, and there's a very famous opera, Medea. Again, I'm kind of drawn to these stories of villainous women. Medea is most known for killing her children in a fit of rage, and as a punishment to her ex, which just is horrifying. But the story itself is really about a woman scorned, and I always question when I hear stories like that, who is telling the story. And so I wanted to kind of deconstruct that. I also, as I'm bringing in this other goddess that predates the mythology that we're all kind of familiar with, because she definitely has origins outside of Greece. She definitely was part of some other culture that was absorbed by the Greeks, and so her origin story is very disjointed, and her mythology is kind of shoehorned into later kind of mythology. So, and I'm talking specifically about the goddess Hecate, which comes into this story that I wrote. So it's all of this, this Greek mythology that has its origins in other places, other cultures, and how that kind of changed the narrative and how they kind of tried to fit that in. And so, I really just wanted to do Greek myth, but in a way that hadn't really been done before, with characters that maybe we weren't super familiar with.
Brilliant. And Ciannon, you mentioned about going to Jamaica and kind of finding out about witches and the role of witches in Jamaica. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about if there were sort of specific stories or mythologies that you have heard and are particularly fascinated by, that sort of make their way in some way into your book.
I think every kind of folk tale in Jamaica is terrifying. One of the stories that I heard as a kid and stayed with me into adulthood is about a creature called a rolling calf, and I won't spoil too much, although I maybe have just spoiled by saying that, but it's this creature that kind of sits and waits at a crossroads, and there are lots of different kind of ways to banish these Jamaican monsters that I absolutely love. Like in one case, this creature shucks its skin and flies through the night to draw blood from its enemies, and in order to nullify it, you need to put salt and pepper on its skin. So there were all of these kind of stories that I grew up hearing, and you hear them because the Caribbean is a land of oral storytelling more so than reading them. And I just loved this idea of stories being passed on, although I don't know why nobody told me about obeah magic, and I had to find that out for myself. So when it came to the actual writing of Witches Steeped in Gold, I didn't have to do much research because I had grown up with a lot of what I was writing about, like tiny little things, like topography, aspects that went into the world, and kind of like the heat. I remember the first time I went to Jamaica, and I was born in England and I still live here, and I stepped off the plane and it was like I couldn't breathe. The air was just so thick, it would just knocked me for sick. So there are some quite visceral experiences that I was able to put into the world. But as far as Obi and magic, I mean, they don't call them witches. I kind of took lots of things and gave them my own twist, because it's not a historical fantasy, so luckily I could kind of take liberties with lots of what I was writing about. But the primary thing was just the idea of like light and dark. So I have two orders in my world: Obia, that is very much inspired by the real thing, and then Alhambra, which is totally made up. And I wanted their name, sort of badly in Spanish, to translate into light. So you've got sort of light and dark, but it's like I was saying before about the idea of this taboo magic system not really being taboo, but being labeled as such because it was misunderstood. So I really sought to invert this idea of what light and darkness is in the book, and taking things like from the histories and sort of twisting them to suit my own purposes. So the main thing that Witches is inspired by, I did not grow up hearing, but then the heart of the book are things that I grew up hearing. Like, the world is matriarchal. My aunts were the ones who were inviting people over for like Christmas and Easter. They were the ones who were hosting these events. And so when it came time to building this world, I wanted it to be a matriarchy. I wanted it to be ruled by women, and I wanted to give women this center stage, because that's all I ever really knew. Like my mom, my grandma, my aunts, I have quite a big family. But it was always kind of the one or two aunts that would bring everyone together. So lots of the book, I guess I kind of wrote it from my heart, as cheesy as that sounds. But then other bits I definitely I discovered along the way, or I just hopped on the phone with a family member in Jamaica and asked my questions to make sure that I was handling things respectfully. But yeah, I'm glad that it feels, I'm always really stunned whenever anyone kind of says anything about the world, because it was, world building is I mean, I don't know what the others will say, but it's kind of like, it's just never ending. It just goes on and on and on forever. So I'm glad that the world, well, my world, I don't, I've read the Gilded ones by now, and it's amazing. But I'm glad the world feels real.
You got a nod there from Kalynn about world building going on forever and ever. We'll talk about that in a second. Now I'm going to tell us a little bit about if there are any sort of stories or mythologies that have influenced the Gilded ones. There's lots of sun imagery in the book. There's obviously this idea of golden blood, and I didn't know if that was something that you had completely made up, or if you'd kind of adapted from kind of folk tales or anything like that.
It's funny, the Gilded Ones is not based on any mythology. I always get this question. No, I just like made it all up. I think basically how I came up with the world was, I wanted, as I said, I was like, I want to explain what patriarchy looks like. And I wanted to explain what happens with the commodification of women, meaning women being objects. And I was like, what's the easiest way to explain that? Oh, what if they bleed gold? Because if they bleed gold, that means that you can literally show how they are used as money. And so that's where that came from. And with the sun imagery, I will say that I think one of the things that like deeply influenced me, sort of like on a level that I didn't realize, was so Angelique Kidjo is one of my favorite singers, and she has this song called Agolo, and Angelique Kidjo is like a famous African singer, and she did this song called Agolo, and there was a music video that I used to watch. I think I had to have been like 6 or 7, and it was like, and I'd never seen anything like it, because it was basically African deities dancing, and like they were covered in gold, and there was all this sort of imagery, and I think it just sort of stuck on a subconscious level. So like when I was writing the book, I just sort of vomited it out. Like I really think that that's sort of where a lot of that came from. But like certain things in the book, I will say, came from just, growing up in Sierra Leone. For instance, the masks. Sierra Leone is a mask culture. We have masks for everything. I have like 20 different masks in this house. So That's where that came from. But like, yeah, no mythology.
Yeah. So how did you said you sort of, it all came out onto the page and into the story. How do you build a world? Do you have post-it notes? Like I can see Ciannon has got sort of cards behind her, or do you have sort of a Bible for your world? How do you put something together that kind of makes sense all the way through for you and your characters?
So I do a lot of research. I will say that The Gilded Ones was a very research heavy book. Like I didn't do research on the feminism because I was taking women's studies. Like at the time the book was brewing, so that was sort of already there. In terms of the world, like literally I read every dry, dusty textbook ever that there was on pre-colonial Africa, because I really wanted to get a sense of what things looked like, so that I could then scaffold and sort of build things on it. And the more that I researched, honestly, like the angrier I got, because like my dad was a like sort of an amateur historian, so he told me all these stories, and I didn't realize that, like about like pre-colonial African kingdoms, and I didn't realize that they were true until I was reading these books, and I was like, wait a second, like, you know, there are all these castles and kingdoms and knights and like all these things, we had all these things, like it just it really sort of made me upset during research, because so often we're told that like that basically the entire continent of Africa is like this dark expanse and that there's nothing there, when I'm like, oh my gosh, there's like thousands of years of just like all kinds of like amazing things. So basically lots of research. And I tend to write outlines, but like not for world building. I feel like with world building, it just sort of, I don't know, it's sort of in the gut, like again, but it's always based on a firm sort of platform, or rather firm foundation of what is true.
Yes. And Kalynn, what about you for This Poison Heart? Obviously, like we've said, it's in our world, but there's all of this sort of nature and all of these plants. Are you a green-fingered person, or did you have to kind of go out and do all that research and sort of fit it together as it would be for your world?
Yeah, I have the opposite of a green thumb. I kill plants, like plants that people say I shouldn't be able to kill. I manage to destroy them. So, yeah, I don't I don't have any of my main characters' gifts in that way. But for me, you know, the world building is the world that my stories are set in usually comes to me first. I usually start with some idea of what this world will look like and what the rules are there, and then I kind of move into you know, what kind of character should kind of guide us through this world and through its kind of with all of its rules, and with Cinderella is Dead, you know, there was a lot of, it was clear to me that it was going to be a very heteronormative society, a society where women were violently oppressed, and you know, the perfect kind of person to show us that world was this young woman who was kind of on the outside looking in. She was a person who society you know, says belongs in this box over here, and she doesn't want anything to do with that. With This Poison Heart, it was more about having my main character Bree, you know, she's just this teenage girl who is dealing with you know, kind of growing apart from her friends and school, and you know, the financial kind of hardships that come along with your neighborhood being gentrified, and she's dealing with all these very real world issues. But then she also has this ability that that kind of comes in and messes everything up, and she's trying to figure out how to balance those two things. And so I think that for me, it's, you know, no matter what kind of world I'm building or how fantastical it is, it's important to ground it in something that feels relatable. And so So that work is done with the characters. You know, this story could be set, you know, on the moon. Like, no, you know, it doesn't really matter, you know, if people don't care about the characters. And so kind of creating these characters that people can root for or hate, or, you know, just, you know, as long as there is some kind of emotion evoked there, I think that's, you know, that's kind of the in for these fantastical worlds.
And Ciannon, what about you? Have you got kind of a massive dossier for your world that you still add to? You're kind of saying it's almost like a never-ending process. Talk a little bit about it.
I wish I was organised enough to sort of keep a dossier. I think I did attempt to do that, but for me, it's like what Namina was saying, lots of the world building is like a gut thing. So it kind of happens as I am writing, lots of things sort of come to mind. I knew the basics of what I wanted. I knew that the world would be filled with opposition. I knew that I wanted my world to feel like a character. So when my actual characters were making decisions, they would have to take parts of the world into consideration. I used to be an English teacher, a high school English teacher. So similarly to Kalynn, I love the Gothic. So even though I have this really hot climate, I wanted it to feel quite creepy, and I wanted it to have some Gothic undertones to it as well. So I think I mean, what do people say? Like the curtains are blue and they're just blue and there's no reasons for it. But then as a teacher, you kind of, when you're teaching like language analysis and whatever, you the curtains are never blue just to be blue. There's always a reason. So for me, there's lots of subtle things in the world that maybe readers aren't identifying, but I am picking up those little details. Like Jasmine's surname Carriot is like a play off Iscariot, so she is foreshadowed to be sort of someone who is quite avoiding spoilers. You need to watch your back when you're around her, essentially. And Ira's name is Ira Adair, and I like that it sounded a bit like I dare when you kind of break it down to the initials and the surname, and she as a character is very daring. So there's lots of like little tiny details in the world building for me that I love putting in the book, more so than the bigger details, which is where I end up getting notes from my editor like, you know, we need this to be fleshed out just a little bit more so that the readers know what you're talking about, and I'm sort of fixated on naming things and places and people. So it is, though, it's just like kind of layering a cake, a 15-tiered cake, and each layer has like 50 different pieces on there that you need to put on. The only good kind of thing about world building is that if you are writing a series and your second and third books are set in that world, then the hard work is mostly done in book one, which has been kind of nice for me writing book two.
Amazing. Just to let everyone know that we'll do sort of another 5 minutes and then we'll do some audience questions, so do pop them in the Q&A box. One of the things that all your books have in common is that obviously they all feature amazing young women who are the heroes of your stories, but also sometimes kind of the anti-heroes as well. Occasionally they might not always do what seems to be the good thing, quote unquote, or they might be tempted to do something that others would consider bad, or would sort of be like, oh, you shouldn't do that, it's not safe. And I wondered if the three of you could sort of talk about those nuances and how they perhaps help you create a new kind of strong female character, to use the dreaded term that I think has become a bit overused. Namina, do you want to kick off with that?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And it's interesting because I think my protagonist, Deka, really does try to do the good thing. Or to be more precise, she tries to do the thing that is asked of her, which I think is sort of a fine line. And because she tries to do the thing that is asked of her, that's actually how she gets into trouble, because part of the whole arc of the story is her learning how to actually ask questions and to have the agency to ask, questions before she does things. And so a lot of this book is her sort of dealing with the trauma of not only the decisions that she's made, but the decisions that she's caught in. And as to building a strong female character, I always sort of like, I have thoughts about that word, just because I think oftentimes we're taught that strength is actually physical strength. But for me, especially in terms of the Gilded Ones, Deka's strength is actually in her emotion, in her emotionality. Is that even a word, y'all? Is emotionality a word?
Yeah, we'll make it a word, don't worry.
So it's in sort of her emotionality. It is in her ability to sort of build bridges with other people, because yes, she's physically strong, but until she like sort of figures out what's happening inside, she just has strength without agency. So she's like doing a lot of things, but like doesn't know why she's doing them. And I think the true strength is once she sort of taps into what's inside and like has like that conversation that she needs to have with herself about the person that she is. I don't know if that makes sense. That felt sort of like a answer that wafted, but here we are.
It made perfect sense. It was wonderful. Kalynn, what about you? Tell us a little bit about Briseis, who is both a hero, but then is also, you know, it's in the title, there are poisons that she is drawn towards, and even, you know, right at the beginning, before she makes her way with her mums to this house, she's growing this poisonous plant in secret in a park, which seems risky as anything.
Yeah, she's not always making the smartest choices but she's 16, so I'm gonna, you know, I'll give her a little bit of a break. But she, you know, I really love complicated characters. I love characters, you know, I think that we tend to have a very binary view of the world sometimes. You know, people are either good or bad. And I have found that that is rarely the case. Usually people are a combination of things and experiences, and people mess up and learn to do better, and some people don't. And it's, you know, it's never just, you know, as cut and dry as it seems. But you know, I explored that kind of duplicit nature of characters a lot in Cinderella is Dead. And when I came to writing this Poisoned Heart, I really was thinking about, you know, redemption arcs and what that looks like when you know, it doesn't end in self-sacrifice or death, or, you know, how do we hold characters kind of accountable who have done villainous things? And I think that that's a question that my main character Briseis is really grappling with, because she has experienced a lot of loss, and she's trying to figure out, you know, are these people bad, or are they doing things that are villainous because they've been pushed into it, or, you know, what is the situation there? But, you know, with heroes, I think that, you know, the heroes in my stories are just people who make a choice to care about someone other than themselves. I think that they rarely want to be seen as heroes. They're not doing it for, you know, a pat on the back or the recognition. They're mostly looking at their world and their community and the people that they care about and saying, you know, something is terribly wrong here and I have to do something. And so, you know, Briseis and Sophia from Cinderella is Dead, they're really just young women who have decided that they care about their communities, they care about their family, their friends, and they are willing to kind of put everything on the line to try to make sure that people are safe and that they themselves can be fully and unapologetically who they are. And so, you know, kind of like Namina was saying, it's not always about, you know, your physical kind of strength. It really, you know, sometimes comes down to, or is a combination of, you know, physical strength, but also this emotional response and the way that we kind of navigate the world and our relationships. And I think there's a lot of strength to be found in that too.
And Ciannon, as Kalynn was sort of talking there about heroes who sort of look beyond themselves and know they have to do something to kind of save other people or help other people. That sort of seems to apply to both of your characters who face some really difficult choices and do have to, or are in the position of sort of somebody telling them you have to do this terrible thing, but it is for the greater good. Can you talk about those choices a little bit?
Oh, I love that phrase, for the greater good. Many atrocities have been committed under that kind of umbrella. I love the dichotomy of heroism and villainy. I just love that grey space in between where you have characters who are making choices for the greater good, but often their journey to get there is bad. I just think that grey characters or characters who don't necessarily follow that one straight path and have questions, like Decker in the Gilded Ones, or kind of do things that aren't necessarily totally straight. I just think that makes them so much more interesting, and I think it's more realistic as well, because I think as much as we all want to do what's right and what's good, sometimes doing what's right and what's good isn't doing what's right and what's good. It's harder to do it the right way, or what is the right way. So I love the idea of multiple paths and multiple journeys that characters can take to get from point A to point B. And Ira and Jasmine, both as characters, their hearts are mostly in the right place, but the decisions and choices that they make to reach the end of the story are often bad. But I didn't want them to feel bad in the sense that as you're reading, you're yelling at them like, that's such a dumb decision. It's like, why is this character going into that obviously frightening house? I didn't want it to feel like that. I wanted it to feel like they were between a rock and a hard place. Both choices are really difficult and they kind of have to pick, in Jasmine's case, the lesser of two evils, and in Ira's case, you know, if it's evil, so what? It's evil. I'm going to get what I want at the end of it. So I just find that, like Kalynn was saying, this binary, exploring the space in between and really focusing on that and producing characters that felt realistic. It was so much fun for me because I love characters like that. I mean, you could argue that Amy from Gone Girl is just outright sociopathic, but she's doing it, she does what she does for her marriage. So it's kind of like, yes, she's crazy, but she has kind of good reasons. So I love kind of presenting characters for readers to kind of, you know, do I hate this person or am I rooting for this person? There are some characters in Witches Steeped in Gold that you obviously hate, like the Doyenne, and I loved this. Just lots of different sayings, like for the greater good, and every villain is the hero of their own story, and no hero is like goes into things thinking I'm going to be a hero. So just lots of different ideas and taking them to kind of subvert expectations and to just have you on the fence about who to support until the very end was just fascinating for me. And the idea of a strong female character, I think, is even more damaging when it's a Black character, because so often in society it's like you've got this stereotype of the strong Black woman, and it's just like you put up and shut up effectively. So I like this idea of like the guys were saying, just focusing on emotional strength and vulnerability. I think vulnerability in itself is an incredibly is a sign of incredible strength, to put your trust in other people, and that's something that Ira and Jasmine also have to combat over the course of the book. Of course, that's because you can't trust anyone in Witches Steeped in Gold, but largely it's about breaking down barriers. And I think that for all three of our books, presenting characters who don't lean into this idea of the strong female, but instead demonstrates strength and other sort of virtues more so than the physical.
Amazing, thank you. Let's do some audience questions. So Alice wants to know from you all, what was the hardest part about writing your book and what was the easiest part about writing your book? So who wants to tackle that first? Kalynn, your mic is on, so you can go first.
The hardest part about writing this book was oh my goodness, maybe just there's a lot of like pop culture references, a lot of references to things that are very, that are contemporary. I didn't want to date the book too much, by having all of these references, but I wanted to make it you know, very relatable, and I wanted people to read it and be like, okay, I get that, you know, I catch that reference. And so that was a challenge, you know, just not wanting to date the book too much. The easiest part for me was this book feels much more personal to me. There's a lot more of myself in this book than there was in Cinderella is Dead, especially in Bree's her mom Thandi. That character and I have a lot of similarities, and so that was fun, and that was kind of easy. I didn't have to flesh out that character too much, because she just came very naturally to me. And when my kids read the book, they were like, is that you? Like, did you put yourself in there? And I was like, yeah, a little bit. So that was fun, and that was you know, an easy kind of thing for me to do.
Amazing. Namina, what about you? Hardest and easiest?
I think the hardest part of writing the book was definitely dealing with the traumatic things that happened in a way that was sensitive and not sensational. There's a lot of violence that happens in the Gilded Ones, and I never use violence without it having a point. And I also make it a point to sort of examine what are the after effects of violence. A lot of characters in the book have PTSD and are sort of dealing with it. And I wanted to ensure that I did it in a way that was truthful and honest. And so sometimes, like in writing a scene, I had to be like, oh, this is a lot. Let me go do something else, and then I'll come back. So that was the hardest part. The easiest part was honestly world building. I think I'm a natural world builder just because I've spent like basically my entire life in fantasy. So like once I have that, the research down, like the rest of the world sort of flows, and it is my favorite thing to do. And I have to like sometimes pull back because then I want to start adding stuff and like, but yeah.
Amazing. And Ciannon, what about you?
For me, the hardest part, I'll kind of divert a bit from the craft side of things. For me, it was sort of like the little tweaks that you do quite far into the process. So you've done all your edits, you've done your line editing, and then because we were in the middle of this pandemic, getting paper copies of your book, it wasn't happening. So everything was done on PDF. And that for me was like the hardest part. I'm not particularly tech savvy. So the writing part and all the drafts that you go through, I would take that every day over learning how to edit in a PDF with like your deadline creeping closer and closer and closer. I would take that over that part of things. And the easiest part for me is probably the descriptions. I love a pretty sentence. In the beginning, it was to my detriment. I mean, where was my plot? Who knows? But the writing was often very, very beautiful. That's what I find easiest, just going through and writing descriptions. And it's still to my detriment. I still have to strip lots of things back when I send my book in. But that's the best part, the most enjoyable for me.
Amazing, thank you. Ayan asks, when you get ideas for a story, do you ever feel overwhelmed by them? And if yes, how do you cope with that feeling?
Yes, definitely. Witch Steeped in Gold was the overwhelming idea for me. I didn't think I had the imagination to write a fantasy world, a totally fictitious fantasy world. I didn't think I could do it, and I kind of literally attacked it in stages. You break it down and you make it small and manageable, and then you work through each of those pieces. An author I really love who gives lots of fantastic advice is Victoria Schwab, and something that she said was it's just a word, and that word forms a sentence, and that sentence builds a paragraph, and then you have a page, and so on and so forth. And particularly world building, I am only a mere mortal compared to Namina when it comes to this enjoyment and ability to just world build. That really helped me, just breaking it down into manageable pieces and kind of working through each of those pieces, and also kind of like focusing on the weaker parts of the book, more so than the things that you enjoy doing. Leave those things until last, and it's like a bit of a reward, in my case anyway.
Okay. Namina?
I'm sorry, I forgot the question already.
So do you ever feel overwhelmed when you sort of get an idea for a story? And if so, how do you deal with that?
I don't think overwhelmed is the word. When I get an idea for a story, it's almost like I'm on drugs because I have like this jittery feeling and I'm so excited and I want to write. I think how I manage that is that I'm sort of very aware of my process, and my process is this. I have the idea, I talk about it to everyone I know, and if they're like, oh, this is cool, there's something there, I'm like, okay, proceed. So then I put it in my bank, meaning I put it at the back of my head, and I go about my business doing like everything else that I have to do. And typically it takes like a year from the minute I have the idea to the minute I actually start working on it in a tangible way. What I mean by that is, okay, so I've had the idea, I've talked to people, I've banked it. And so what I'll then do is passive research just to like, figure out what is the world, what are the themes or whatever. So I'll like watch YouTube or whatever, but I won't like active, like it won't be like aggressive research. It'll be like, oh, I'll read something here or there so as not to overwhelm myself. And so to have it like sort of seep into a subconscious level. And then it's very freaky how it happens, but literally a year from when I had the idea to I'll like be watching a movie, or like I'll wake up and have a dream and all of a sudden the idea comes again and it's like bigger, brighter, better. But now I have all the research. So then I bounce it back and forth again before I then write my outline or my synopsis, and then I finally write it. So I guess in that, how to keep from being overwhelmed, bank your idea. Know that like, just because it's like you're feeling it and it's right now doesn't mean you have to write right now. Like just let it sit, let it develop, go do something else, and then it'll come back bigger and brighter than ever. At least, yeah, anyway.
Kalynn, what about you?
Yeah, I do. I get a lot of story ideas. I get a lot of, moments where I think of something and I'm like, oh, this is great. I want to do this, but I have, 20 other things I have to do first. So usually what I'll do is I'll write it down. I'll type it out, I'll print it out, and I'll stick it in like its own like folder on my shelf. And I have like 50 folders. It's just kind of my way of putting the idea down on paper. And then if something else, kind of like Namina was saying, like over time with that, sitting with that idea, other things will come to me. I'll add that to the folder. And then at some point I will feel like I'm ready to write it. And that's kind of how I deal with the many ideas, because I'm constantly daydreaming and I'm constantly, taking in other types of media, music, film, other books. And so I'm constantly getting these ideas, which I'm grateful for, but I have, things that are under contract and I have to write those first. So I usually will just write it down and put it away and add to it when I can. And then, those things, I'll get around to them at some point. But I also sometimes get ideas where I feel like maybe I'm not ready to write that story yet. And I think that that's okay. I have to kind of be okay with saying, you know what, I don't really think that I'm at the point where I can do this story justice. And that's kind of a different thing than kind of letting the idea sit. So I still have those ideas and I still write them down, but there are maybe like 2 stories that I have right now where I don't think I'm at a point where I can actually sit down and do the story justice. And so I'll sit with those for as long as I need to until I feel like I'm ready. It really is just about knowing what works for me and what my priorities are, and that's worked for me so far.
It's so interesting because I think a lot of people assume that once you have an idea, you have to sit down and write it out, and sort of, it doesn't seem to be the case. A question from Megan, who wants to know how you felt when you first saw your books on a shelf in a bookshop, provided, of course, in this pandemic, you have been able to go to a bookshop and see your books on a shelf?
I cried. I cried everything, by the way. Like, it's just, you know, generally I see a beautiful sunset, I cry. Niffy sneezes, I cry. But these were actual, really warranted tears of just joy. I've wanted to be an author for so long. It took me 12 years just to get an agent. So like for me, it was sort of like the culmination of a lifelong dream come true. And so it was, I cried. I was so happy. Yeah.
Kalynn, what about you? I guess, when did you, what happened when you first saw Cinderella is Dead on the bookshelves?
Yeah, it was kind of in the middle of everything. Of, you know, pandemic was, you know, kind of at its peak, but it's Texas, so they didn't really close anything. I put on a mask. I put on a mask and went to Barnes and Noble and saw it, took a picture and left. And so I, you know, it was a really emotional thing because, you know, I worked so hard on that book, and then the pandemic kind of happened, and I was like, okay, well, I don't even know how this is going to go. And, but seeing it there on the shelf was really just kind of like, okay, you know, we did it. The story is done. It's there. It belongs to the readers now. It's a really emotional thing. It's a really emotional thing. And yeah, I definitely shed some tears.
And Ciannon, what about you? Have you been able to go to a bookshop and take a look at your book?
I did. I went to a Waterstones, a little distance from where I live, and it was lovely to just see it there. It was on a table with everyone else's books, and so seeing it in familiar company was lovely. And it's just a very surreal thing. Largely it's just been on a computer on my desktop, and then it was there in physical format. I think the really weird thing is people sending you pictures of your book, them seeing it in other stores. That's really weird, and really, really cool. Yeah.
Amazing. I think we can squeeze in probably one more question. So I'm going to ask this one. This person didn't send their name, but how would you feel about your books being adapted for TV or film? And are any of your books being adapted for TV or film?
Mine is becoming a movie. I am very excited, very happy. Yeah, like, yes to adaptation, definitely.
I don't know, film or TV. I'm not sure which would work best. Maybe the episodic nature of the chapters means it would work best as like a TV show, but I can't talk about anything to do with TV. It would be very cool if it happened. But yeah.
Okay, we'll watch this space then. And Kalynn, what about you?
Yeah, I think that would be great. I think that's all that I can say about that. That would be great. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of like bound by various things, which is we'll end on that note on a question that we weren't able to really answer for everybody, but I think it's a good place to end. If you haven't read This Poison Heart, which is steeped in gold and the gilded ones yet, then you can obviously purchase them from your local Waterstones or online at the Waterstones website, and I really urge you to do so, because these are some wonderful books with some worlds that you're absolutely going to sink into. And I will, on behalf of everyone watching, I will say thank you to Kalynn, to Ciannon and to Namina for their time today. It's been absolutely wonderful. Thank you and goodbye.